Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Andrea Inserra, president of the Global Defense Sector at Booz Allen, in an interview from the Association of the United States Army's Global Force Symposium in Huntsville, Alabama. And then we break down the latest on the U.S. campaign against the Houthi rebels, China's major military drills near Taiwan, and the prospect of the Trump administration levying major sanctions or tariffs on Russia's oil sector. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. A lot of news to get through on this show. Later on, we have a great interview with Andrea Inserra, president of the Global Defense Sector at Booz Allen, about AI, the Golden Dome, the evolution of the defense industry, and a lot more. But before we get to that, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week on the podcast. One thing I'm tracking is how the Trump administration's Mideast policy seems to really be taking shape now through the expansion of a U.S. military bombing campaign against the Houthi militants in Yemen, militants that the Pentagon and U.S. intelligence have long said are essentially a proxy of Iran. Remember, this campaign against the Houthis was at the center of the blow-up last month over a group chat among top Trump administration officials on the messaging app Signal that a journalist was accidentally added to. That chat made it quite clear that the administration is determined to essentially rout the Houthis. It was on the Signal chat where National Security Advisor Mike Waltz openly lamented that during the Biden years, the U.S. allowed global shipping to be, quote, shut down, end quote, by Houthi missile attacks on commercial vessels and U.S. military ships in the Red Sea, and that Biden's team had only engaged in, quote, pinprick attacks, end quote, against the Houthis as retaliation, and that a key part of the new Trump approach would instead involve, quote, knocking the crap out of terrorists, end quote. Well, this week, Ben, we saw the Pentagon announce the deployment of a second U.S. carrier strike group to the Mideast to essentially ramp up the campaign against the Houthis. The first round of bombing targets in Yemen was on March 15. The second round, a larger wave of strikes on March 28. And then again on March 31st. Interestingly, the Pentagon has not been publishing details about the latest strikes. So there's a kind of a lack of transparency around this in the wake of that leaked Signal chat and Broglio, Ben. But my sources are telling me that this campaign fits with a wider administration policy on Iran, really of putting maximum pressure on Iran-backed proxies. It's important to note that the bombing of Houthi targets in Yemen in recent days came basically just as Israel renewed its own bombing campaign against Iran-backed Hezbollah targets in Lebanon on April 1. Israeli forces claim to have killed a key Hezbollah figure, an Iranian Quds Force collaborator, with an airstrike near Beirut on that day, Ben. Sources of mine in the Mideast say the dual U.S.-Israeli actions are seen in the region as a coordinated effort to ramp up pressure on Iran, as really part of the Trump administration's push to contain Tehran's accelerating nuclear program. It's all happening, Ben, as Iran's government has rejected an offer from President Trump that Trump put forward in a letter recently to Iran offering to reopen direct nuclear talks with the U.S. Shifting gears, one other thing, Ben, I'm also tracking the latest Chinese military drills that occurred around Taiwan in recent days. Remember, Beijing has stated publicly that it wants to take control of Taiwan, a U.S. aligned island democracy, using force if necessary. The drills, which included live fire exercises, came just days after U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made a tour of the Pacific. Hegseth stopped last week in the Philippines, where he announced beefing up of U.S. Military equipment there. He talked about how focused the Trump administration is on countering China's military muscle flexing, both around the Philippines and the South China Sea, but also around Taiwan. Finally, Ben, I want to mention that talk of President Trump's push for a Golden Dome missile defense shield is really growing in national security circles and the defense industrial circles. I know it's going to come up in our feature interview in a couple of minutes, but it's probably going to continue to grab headlines next week, as there are two major events occurring that are highlighting national security innovation in space. The Sea Air Space Conference in Maryland and the 40th Space Symposium in Colorado both take place next week. Most of the Golden Dome talk centers on the prospect of a new satellite-based missile defense shield capable of tracking Chinese and Russian hypersonic weapons, Ben. It remains to be seen which agency, the Space Force, the Missile Defense Agency, and so on, will ultimately implement and operate such a system, and whether Trump will maybe appoint a Golden Dome czar. We're tracking all of that at Threat Status, and we'll actually be holding a major Golden Dome event on May 13th with defense industry leaders. Ben, we'll be talking more about that in upcoming podcasts between now and then.
You know, Guy, you mentioned President Trump and his attempted diplomatic outreach to Iran. I want to stay on the theme of diplomacy here for a minute, because as we record this, on Thursday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Brussels for a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. And the timing is pretty interesting on a number of fronts. Number one, because of President Trump's tariffs announcement, which I'll talk more about here in a minute, but also, you know, questions about the future role of the U.S. and NATO. The Signal group chat that you mentioned, we talked about at length last week, included Vice President Vance and Defense Secretary Hegseth complaining about Europe. Hegseth called their freeloading, quote, pathetic, unquote. Rubio seems to be doing a bit of damage control, or maybe a good cop, if you will, to the Hegseth-Vance bad cop. He said this as he arrived today, quote, "The United States is as active in NATO as it has ever been, and some of this hysteria and hyperbole that I see in the global media and some domestic media in the United States about NATO is unwarranted," unquote. Listeners can make their own determinations on whether Rubio is right based on some of the things, documented things that Trump, Hegseth, Vance, and other officials have said. Back to the tariffs here for a second, and specifically what could be coming next on the national security side of this. The president announced, of course, he would impose a baseline tariff of 10% on all imports and additional reciprocal tariffs on, quote, worst offender, unquote, nations. The rate on China, for example, is expected to be 34%. We can dive into the broader economic and geopolitical implications of all of this another time, but it's worth spending a minute to talk about how the U.S. could be on the verge of another major economic move. Earlier this week, President Trump told NBC News that he's, quote, pissed off, unquote, that Russian President Vladimir Putin so far hasn't signed on to a ceasefire deal in Ukraine. And as you highlighted in the Threat Status newsletter this week, Guy, there are signs Putin might not have any intention of doing so at all. So what can the U.S. do? Analysts tell me, of course, that it could take the gloves off and go after Russian energy exports. It's oil, crude oil. Those exports provide up to half of all federal budget revenues in Russia. And this could unfold in one of two ways, and I explore this in the Washington Times this week. The U.S. could traditionally sanction Russian energy firms, make it illegal for Americans to do any business with them, block access to the U.S. banking system for anyone abroad who does business with them. Or there's this more novel approach, I guess you could say, that Trump has floated and that seems to have some momentum in Congress, the secondary tariffs. In other words, countries that buy lots of Russian oil now, China and India being at the top of that list, would face stiff tariffs on all goods they export to the U.S. unless they stop buying that Russian oil. Trump mentioned secondary tariffs of 50%. A bipartisan coalition of senators this week introduced legislation that would put that number at 500%, which is just kind of crazy. I wonder, does 500% influence decision making in foreign capitals more than, say, 300% or 400%? I'm not sure.
It's a good question, Ben. Good question.
I don't know, but some analysts I've talked to describe this as, quote, the nuclear option, because it could have some major ramifications, obviously, on energy markets and global economics. But geopolitically, I mean, how would India react, for example, if we impose those kinds of secondary tariffs on the oil that it's buying from Russia? Would Russia blink, or would it choose to maybe escalate further? It's something I'll be watching closely for a number of reasons, not the least of which that if the Trump administration actually does this guy, I think it'll be hard for critics to keep arguing that Trump is soft on Russia, because by virtually all accounts, this would be a significant step on the part of the administration. And we are joined now by Andrea Inserra, president of the global defense sector at Booz Allen. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast.
Good morning, Ben. Glad to be here.
So I want to start with missile defense, which I know is a topic that you're excited to talk about, and we are too, and specifically President Trump's Golden Dome proposal. Do we need an education campaign on this nationally? Because, and you see this as I do. A lot of folks still think this is about ground-based THAAD capabilities. Some people criticize it even more generally, saying that we don't need this. Why do we need the Israeli Iron Dome system in the U.S.? We don't have rocket artillery fire coming at the U.S. as they do in Israel. Of course, we're talking about something very different, a comprehensive space-based missile defense system. So do people just misunderstand this, or is there a deliberate attempt in some quarters to distort what the Golden Dome is actually going to be about?
I think people misunderstand it. I don't think it's an ill intent. I just think people are trying to understand, first of all, how will weapons truly hit the U.S.? I think that's out of the realm of most people's perspective. They don't think of, we've always felt as a safe part of the world. And so when you start thinking about weapons with pretty large magnitude of destruction coming into the U.S., I think people can understand, let's create a shield, but they have to get first past the point of, well, these can hit us into the United States. So that's point one. But point two is, well, why don't we have systems, the misunderstanding of why don't we have systems that could counter those? And I think that is part of the misunderstanding. But what I'm excited about since the president announced this executive order is that the technology we have today is far different than we would have had during President Reagan's era, when he also had a similar initiative, but the technology wasn't available to us. So for people in the industry, when we think about the space assets that we have today, the combination of peer-to-peer networks and the combination of AI, you put those three capabilities together today, you can actually create a space-layered missile defense capability for the United States that probably, and I could say, was not possible during the Reagan era. So for technologists or folks that are in the industry, this makes sense. And I think the technology and where we are from a price perspective of enabling the technology is affordable.
Well, I was going to ask, so what about the cost? I talked to Trey Obering about this recently. Yeah. I mean, he mentioned that he thinks we could potentially do this for a half of the cost of what we did 2 decades ago building THAAD batteries in the West Coast. Is that realistic?
I think it is realistic, because when you think about our launch capabilities compared to 20, 30 years ago, think about what it takes from a launch capability, the manufacturing capability of these small satellites, because we're not talking about massive satellites, we're talking about like cube satellites. The cost has gone down considerably, and it's the government's reliance on private sector, right? So that interface and integration between the two, I think, is also the difference, where during the Reagan administration, maybe not as much so. And so I think it is possible today.
What's the time frame on this in your view?
Well, I would say initial prototyping capabilities in the several years category until you're up with a full operating capability, probably years away.
Yeah.
But those initial concepts is what we really need to push for. So as we engage with industry partners as well as the government, how do you think about launching these prototype enablers to show that we can actually see and possibly detect these missiles, but also intercept at the right time?
Does this, by definition, weaponize space to some, if not already, because I mean, at the Space Power Conference, which I attended a few months ago, of course, a lot of folks on the commercial side are concerned about what happens if an adversary starts targeting our stuff that's up there, that's going to be part of this Golden Dome architecture that's there. So is this a step to the inevitable weaponization of space?
I think we understand that our adversaries can weaponize space. And so it's our ability to intercept. So I don't imagine we're going to have weapons on these satellites. I imagine that the satellites themselves will be the interceptor. And I think that in itself, you could call that a weapon, but it's more of the interception of a weapon coming into the United States is the way that we're looking at it. So I'm excited about the opportunity that we actually have to defend ourselves. So I look at it from a defensive positioning as a space, as a major domain from subsea to space. There's many domains that have to work together to enable that.
I want to talk about AI and autonomous systems. You all are obviously a leader in this space, but I want to kind of ask a broad question to start. Last week, we had Dan Hendricks from the Center for AI Safety on the show talking about superintelligence and sort of a lot of almost borderline apocalyptic concerns about loss of control risk and other doomsday scenarios, transparent oceans. Could an adversary, identify nuclear submarines and take out that capability or eliminate U.S. second strike capability, for example? Is some of that overblown in your view from where you sit, or are those real concerns that are top of mind for you as you're working in this space?
I think when you think about AI, it's all about access to data. So when you have the data available to you, what can you do with it? So I think we have to think about ways to safely deploy that data and using algorithms to safely enable decisions. Could decisions like that or effects like that happen in the future? I would say possibly, if you have the right data and you actually have an understanding of where those capabilities are in the world. Sure, absolutely. So I think we have to be even further ahead of the adversaries in terms of the data that they have and countering those capabilities. But I think AI is our future. And everything that we're seeing, and I think we're one of the leading providers of AI for the federal government. And even with 22,000 technologists, engineers deployed today across the U.S. government, it's still, we have to partner with companies. What we have found is that, again, even being the leading AI provider, you still have to co-develop, because the acceleration required for the capabilities that, here today, the Army modernization capabilities, that's what we're talking about in this conference, we have to stay ahead. So where we've spent a lot of our investment is one on training our folks. So that's the 22,000 folks that you have out there working. But it's also in how do we go to market together with other companies. And so we've probably spent about $3 billion in the last 10 years on advanced technology capabilities. And that's everything from acquiring capabilities, which you'll see downstairs with our acquisition with PAR. So that helps us on situational awareness at the edge, to we've invested in 13 startup companies, everything from AI to cyber to space. We have 3 space-related companies. This is where we believe we belong in the ecosystem. So we understand the mission of our Army clients here today, but how do we partner with companies that are like leading edge tech firms to bring those capabilities in an accelerated speed that our clients are requiring? And so that's where our focus today is, on partnership with leading, in this example, AI companies, cyber companies, or other.
How do you see the future, this old refrain of the human in the loop about AI or autonomous systems? That was always, years ago when I started writing about this, was don't worry, there's always going to be a human in the loop with these systems. And now you talk to folks and technology is advancing at a rate that we couldn't have even imagined 10, even 5 years ago. And as you well know, folks will say, if there's a war in the Pacific Theater, for example, there's going to be so many drone swarms, other capabilities, so many decisions, millions of decisions potentially being made instantly in a matter of seconds, minutes. So is that just an outdated sort of idea that there's going to be a human in the loop of when all these decisions are made?
I just spent a few weeks in Hawaii and in the Indo-PACOM talking to clients about what their requirements are for autonomous capabilities with manned capabilities. And the messaging that I'm continuing to hear from our military leaders is human will be in the loop on decisions that matter. And I think that's the connection, is that
so they're giving the orders,
essentially. They'll give the orders, right. So there may be a swarm of autonomous capabilities with man capabilities, but what the autonomous capabilities enable us to do is to hopefully save lives so that we don't have as many men and women in harm's way. So you can put autonomous capability out in front to sense information, but the actually taking down or the lethality from our clients that I believe are sharing the latest perspective is that a man or a human will always be in that loop when those decisions are made. But AI and the capabilities of autonomous systems will give them more data to make faster decisions about what's ahead of them.
Okay.
And I think that's the difference.
Obviously, you all work closely with the federal government, as we just said, but I'm so I'm not going to put you in a position to badmouth the federal government or any particular administration. But broadly speaking, with how fast technology is moving, what all do you want to see in terms of changes, streamlining of the federal government process, acquisition, contracts? I mean, you could talk to probably 100% of respondents. I would ask on the floor would say that needs to be faster,
right,
given where we are right now. So, what specifically do you want to see on that end?
Yeah, I think you hit it, Ben. I think this administration is all about acceleration and getting rid of processes that don't work, that are inefficient. And so from our perspective as a company, we're on board. We believe in how to make the government as efficient as possible. And I think the one key area is in acquisitions, right? So you're starting to hear a lot of software acquisition, kind of modernization of that process. Again, if it takes you several years to develop the requirements, to man the requirements, to hire a company, the requirements are obsolete. So we have to be able to acquire capabilities based on need statements. And then you have I would say, more agility to bring in the right partners from industry to deliver that capability. So for us, that's why we're doing a heavy co-investment with tech firms, because we believe the combination of Booz Allen's talent, mission expertise, and engineering expertise with a technology capability in hand will be an accelerated response to our government. But number one, that acquisition process has to be streamlined. Yeah. And you're already starting to hear our clients talk about it. They talk about CSOs and acquisition pathways for software development.
Yeah.
So that gives me hope.
Yeah. So you've been doing this for quite a while. The defense industry, as you know, has changed a lot in recent years. What's that been like watching from the inside, whether it's, Andrew, or we'll talk more about Shield AI in a second, with the birth of some firms from Silicon Valley and elsewhere across the country that sort of join in the primes and the traditionals in this space. What's it been like watching that transformation from the inside?
Well, the first thing I would say is the integration of the services together. So when we think about integrated domains, it's critically important for us to lead with those firms with the traditional primes. So the Lockheeds and the Boeings and the RTXs, critically important in weapon systems and building weapon capabilities. But what I'm seeing is these tech firms are bringing platforms that may not have been possible in the past because they've had a large investment of funds for commercial, we call it tech reuse, and we're applying it to a government use case, if you want to call it that. So to me, I think it's exciting. Yeah. I think it's necessary if we're going to counter our adversaries who are operating, at a very quick tempo. Yeah. And I think this is our way to stay ahead technologically and to continue to invest.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I wanted to ask you to sort of broaden out to the 30,000 foot view here. How hard is it when you're competing with, for example, we're talking about China, that has pretty top-down control over all of this stuff, and not only top-down control, but very different goals and aims that we do. They are looking to use AI and autonomous systems to figure out ways to disrupt a clean water filtration system in the Midwest or something like that. Things that we as the U.S. just don't really try to do to people. Right. So does that just put us at a natural disadvantage?
I don't know if it puts us sure, we have to detect what they're targeting. So from an industrial controls, that example that you give, critically important that our cyber capability is hardened on those systems to make sure that they're protected. So I think that gives us an opportunity to put more controls on some of those systems. But I always, there's always going to be a race to the technological answer, right? And so I believe in the United States, we have a wealth of intellectual capability, prototype capability that works. It just has to be transferred to this domain. It may be used for another whole application in the commercial side of the business, but then how do you apply it? We're investing in a company called Albedo, which is a space company, and what they're focused on is very low Earth orbit satellites So constellation satellites. When I met with the founder a year and a half ago, I was like, how did you come up with this idea? Because satellites are typically in LEO. And his idea was, no, I want to get it in very low Earth orbit because then it gives us a precision to understand and see better than we see today. And I thought, well, how's that going to work? They just launched their first constellation a month ago. And again, they were just in initial prototype when we started investing in them.
When was that?
That was about a year and a half ago.
That's fast.
It's fast.
Yeah.
And you looked at, and I kind of talked to the founders and their teams, and they're all former from the big primes, from Lockheed and big companies. So they have experience, they have an idea, and then they can get the venture-backed, companies to really invest in their idea. And it's exactly what we need to do. So I think we're far ahead of. Again, are we always worried and always concerned about where our adversaries are technologically? We should be.
Yeah.
But I think there's so much wealth of capabilities in the United States. It's just integration of commercial tech with our government requirements.
Okay. Last thing to wrap up, I want to talk about the Booz Allen partnership with Shield AI, which I believe you just announced last week.
Yep.
My colleague Guy Taylor had some great conversations with the folks at Shield at the IDEX conference a few weeks ago. So this is a hot topic that we're interested in right now, of course. You all said of this partnership, the resulting collaboration will accelerate the development and integration of advanced AI control systems and autonomy into a wide variety of uncrewed systems. So what are some of the specific capabilities that we're talking about?
So Shield AI, it is our largest investment for a venture company. So we're very, very excited. And again, why we invest in those 13 companies I mentioned before and why we would invest in Shield AI is to partner together, to co-create. So from our perspective, as we talked about earlier, autonomous capabilities in these swarms of manned and unmanned capabilities are our future. And so we understand and we've studied and worked with Shield AI. They have capabilities today. They have software today that can enable and pilot autonomous capabilities from like a drone that would strike to an F-16. What we believe is in order to enable more sophistication in autonomous capabilities, you're going to enable that with AI. And so our interest is partnering with them to have AI-enabled software-defined autonomous systems of the future. And we believe the partnership will, again, accelerate faster than we could do it alone as two separate companies. So that is our whole kind of thought as we continue to advance technology for, in this case, the U.S. Army today here, or our clients across defense. That partnership with Shield AI and other companies like that are important. I just spent, about 2 weeks ago, I spent a half a day with AWS leaders. They came to Booz Allen, so it was their defense leaders, our defense leaders. And sure, we each have capabilities that we're each providing to the government today. But think about the power of pulling those two entities together to think about edge-based capabilities that don't exist today. And so we are constantly working with partners like Shield AI, AWS, Palantir, a number of companies to think about how do we go to market differently, because our government clients require that of us. And so when I spent time in the Pacific, it was all about acceleration and integration. You need, and the requirement is you need to give us capabilities that integrate. We can't spend 6 months or a year to integrate your capabilities into our network. It has to integrate. You have to understand that. And that is my fundamental belief why Booz Allen differentiates in those co-creations, is we already understand the networks. We understand how to integrate. And it's really bringing the requirements and our technology capabilities with these capability firms like Shield AI.
Andrea Inserra, thank you so much for joining us here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. Enjoyed it.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically in the U.S., or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what do you have for us as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that global internet tech companies are increasingly susceptible to penetration and spying from North Korean agents. I know that this may sound out of left field and a little bit crazy to some, but Google actually published a new threat intelligence report in recent days that claimed that the scope and scale of North Korea's operation to place spies posing as remote workers inside global IT companies is expanding. My threat of the week is that companies are vulnerable to that North Korean campaign, and they don't take it very seriously because North Korea, despite its advancing cyber and military capabilities, is widely regarded as an old-fashioned 20th century dictatorship, when in reality, the North Korean regime is regarded in intelligence circles as rather advanced when it comes to cyber operations that feature the use of human spies penetrating sensitive companies by posing as tech workers.
Yeah, that's a good one. Guy, my threat of the week involves North Korea as well, but it's the nuclear buildup taking place in North Korea, China, and Russia, along with the status of Iran, as we mentioned, as a nuclear threshold state. We don't have time to get into all the technical details of China's nuclear-capable bombers or Russia's nuclear-armed autonomous Poseidon torpedoes or North Korea's ICBMs or Iran's near-weapons-grade uranium enrichment. But this week, I covered a Washington Times Foundation event featuring Robert Joseph, former U.S. Special Envoy for Nuclear Non-Proliferation, who had a pretty bleak take on what the U.S. can do about that nuclear buildup, which is not much, at least in a traditional sense. He said that, quote, the Cold War concept of arms control is at an end, unquote, meaning that the deals of the past that we kind of grew up with, the START Treaty or the U.S.-Russia INF Treaty, they aren't realistic options in today's environment. The U.S. just doesn't have the leverage to get those countries to the table. I guess the old mutually assured destruction calculus seems to be a bit different. And also, our adversaries, to some degree, may feel like the momentum is on their side in areas like hypersonic weapons, maybe even AI and other arenas. So we do have some options. Guy, you mentioned the Golden Dome. The construction of a Golden Dome missile shield will, of course, help U.S. deterrence, and that could put the momentum back on our side. Maybe at some point there is an opening for a multilateral arms deal that includes the U.S., Europe, Russia, China. But for now, experts seem to think that the U.S. toolbox is kind of empty on this one, and that's why it's my threat of the week.
Interesting, Ben. Thank you for that depth of perspective once again.
Of course. And thank you, Guy. A huge thanks to Andrea Inserra from Booz Allen for coming on the Threat Status podcast. And a big thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share the show with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status podcast.